It's Sunday morning in Notre Dame de Paris. The year is 1248. You can barely move. 15,000 bodies press against you, the air thick with incense and sweat and the smoke of 1,000 candles. The faithful have walked for days to be here. Peasants kneel beside merchants, beside nobles, all equal before God in this moment. The Latin Mass echoes off stone walls that took 100 years to build. Outside, another 10,000 wait their turn to enter. This is what devotion looked like when Europe was the beating heart of Christianity. Now fast forward to Sunday morning, 2024. Same cathedral, different world. 300 people scattered across a space designed for 15,000. Most of them are over 65. A quarter are tourists checking their phones. The priest's voice echoes through a vastness that feels less like holy ground and more like a museum after hours. This isn't just a Notre Dame problem. From Cologne to Canterbury, from Barcelona to Budapest, Europe's magnificent cathedrals stand as monuments to a faith that seems to have quietly slipped away while no one was watching. What happened? How did the continent that gave the world Christianity, that built these impossible structures reaching toward heaven, that launched crusades and inquisitions and missionary movements that touched every corner of the globe, how did it become the most secular place on earth? The answer isn't what you think. It's not just about science or scandal or the Enlightenment. It's far stranger, more complex, and in many ways more tragic than the simple narratives we've been told. Let's start with some numbers that will make your head spin. In 1900, Europe was home to 66% of the world's Christians. Today, 23%. In the United Kingdom, church attendance has collapsed from 40% of the population in 1900 to less than 5% today. Belgium, once so Catholic that it was called the most Catholic country in Europe, now sees only 7% of its population attending Mass regularly. The Czech Republic, once the land of Jan Hus and intense religious devotion, is now 72% atheist or agnostic, making it possibly the most godless nation in human history. But here's where it gets really interesting. Europe didn't lose its faith because cathedrals closed. The cathedrals remain, magnificent as ever, often meticulously maintained. Visit Chartres Cathedral on a Tuesday afternoon, and you'll find it in pristine condition, every stained glass window restored, every stone cleaned, the gift shop well stocked. What you won't find are believers. The buildings became heritage sites, tourist attractions, architectural wonders, everything except what they were built to be, houses of active worship. The transformation was so gradual that it barely registered as a crisis until it was almost complete. Between 1900 and 1950, the change was slow. Wars and political upheaval interrupted normal patterns, but faith remained embedded in European identity. Then came the 1960s, and something broke. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but like a rope fraying strand by strand until one day it simply parts. The Second Vatican Council of 1962 to 1965 modernized the Catholic Church, switching from Latin to local languages, making services more accessible. The intention was to bring people closer to faith. Instead, for many Europeans, it had the opposite effect. The mystery evaporated. When you could understand every word, when the priest faced you instead of the altar, when the ancient rituals were simplified, something ineffable was lost. For centuries, the incomprehensibility of Latin Mass had created a sense of otherworldliness, a feeling that you were touching something beyond human understanding. When that veil lifted, many found not greater clarity but disenchantment. At the same time, prosperity was doing something that poverty never could, making God seem optional. The post-war economic miracle transformed Europe from a continent of scarcity to one of abundance. In 1950, the average European worried about having enough bread. By 1970, they worried about which car to buy. When your daily existence is precarious, when harvests fail, when children die young, when war is a living memory, the promise of eternal life holds tremendous power. When you have health care, pensions, insurance, education, social safety nets, the urgency fades. Sociologist Callum Brown documented something fascinating. Women stopped going to church first, and when women left, Christianity in Europe effectively ended. Between 1963 and 1968, female church attendance in Britain dropped by half. Women had been the backbone of European Christianity, the ones who ensured children were baptized, who organized church activities, who maintained the social fabric of parish life. When they stopped attending within a single generation, the transmission of faith to children ceased almost completely. Why did women leave? Brown's research points to a revolution in female identity. For centuries, Christian teaching had defined women primarily as mothers, wives, moral guardians. The sexual revolution, feminism, and the contraceptive pill offered different possibilities. Suddenly, the church's teachings on sexuality, reproduction, and women's roles seemed less like eternal truth and more like outdated social control. Young women in the 1960s weren't just rejecting specific doctrines. They were rejecting an entire framework for understanding feminine existence. But prosperity and social change don't fully explain the speed and totality of the collapse. After all, America got rich too, experienced the same cultural revolutions, yet remained far more religious. Something particular to Europe was at work. Here's where the story takes a darker turn. Europe's churches didn't just lose a culture war. They lost moral authority, and they lost it by their own hand. The sexual abuse scandals that began emerging in the 1990s and continue today weren't the cause of empty cathedrals. The decline had already been happening for decades, but they slammed shut a door that might have remained slightly ajar. In Ireland, the revelations were apocalyptic in their impact. The 2009 Ryan Report documented systematic abuse in Catholic institutions. The Magdalene laundries, where fallen women were essentially imprisoned and forced into labor, remained open until 1996. Ireland went from 90% mass attendance in 1974 to 36% in 2011. The church had been so powerful in Ireland, so intertwined with national identity, that when its moral pretensions collapsed, the backlash was severe. Today, Ireland has legalized abortion and same-sex marriage by popular referendum, outcomes unthinkable a generation ago. Throughout Europe, similar patterns emerged. In Belgium, Germany, France, Austria, the Netherlands, revelations of abuse, cover-ups, and institutional protection of predators created a toxic association between organized religion and hypocrisy. How could an institution claiming moral superiority, claiming to represent divine truth, have systematically protected men who destroyed children? For many Europeans, this wasn't a matter of bad individuals, but rather proof that the whole edifice was rotten. Yet even this doesn't capture the full picture. Let me tell you about something that happened in Sweden that crystallizes the strangeness of Europe's de-Christianization. The Church of Sweden was the official state church until 2000. Every Swede was automatically born into it, taxes funded it, and its clergy were essentially government employees. In 1970, 95% of Swedes belonged to the Church of Sweden. Today, it's under 60% and dropping fast. Weekly attendance? Less than 2%. But here's the twist. Swedes didn't become hostile to the church. They became indifferent. The Church of Sweden has embraced every progressive cause imaginable. It ordains women, blesses same-sex marriages, advocates for refugees, promotes environmentalism. Its theology is so liberal that many of its clergy are openly agnostic about traditional Christian claims. You can be a Church of Sweden member and essentially believe nothing supernatural at all. This should have made it popular, right? Instead, it's dying anyway. Because once you strip away the transcendent claims, once you make religion just another vehicle for progressive social values, why bother? You can support refugees and climate action without getting up early on Sunday. The Church of Sweden tried to survive by becoming indistinguishable from secular progressive culture. In doing so, it made itself irrelevant. Now, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this from and what time is it? Are you in Europe yourself, seeing these empty churches firsthand? Or are you in a place where faith still thrives, puzzling over how this could happen? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you're finding value in these deep dives into history, consider leaving a super thanks. It helps us keep researching and producing these videos for Professor Archive. The philosophical dimension of this collapse is worth examining. Friedrich Nietzsche declared God is dead in 1882, not as a celebration but as a terrified observation. He predicted that the death of God in European consciousness would lead to nihilism, to a crisis of meaning that would tear civilization apart. He was both right and wrong. Right, because Europe has indeed experienced a crisis of meaning. Birth rates have collapsed to levels never before seen in human history without accompanying catastrophe. Italy, Spain, and Portugal have fertility rates around 1.2 children per woman, far below replacement. In surveys, young Europeans increasingly report feelings of meaninglessness, anxiety, and lack of purpose despite material comfort unprecedented in human history. The structures that used to provide meaning, family, faith, community, nation, have all weakened simultaneously. But Nietzsche was wrong in expecting dramatic catastrophe. The death of God in Europe has been quiet, administrative, bureaucratic. Churches were converted to apartments, nightclubs, bookstores. It happened with permits and planning applications, not upheaval. The most Christian continent became the most secular without revolutions or persecution. It just stopped believing. Compare this to the only period of forced secularization in Europe, the communist era in the East. The Soviet Union and its satellites tried to eradicate religion through oppression. They arrested clergy, demolished churches, imprisoned believers, conducted aggressive atheist propaganda, and they failed. When communism fell in 1989, religion resurged in Poland, Russia, Romania. People had kept faith alive underground, in secret, precisely because it was forbidden. But in the prosperous, free West, religion withered of its own accord. No one forced the Dutch to stop attending their beautiful medieval churches. No one compelled the French to turn ancient abbeys into museums. They chose it, one Sunday at a time, one generation after another, until the choosing itself became unconscious, just the way things were. The intellectual climate played its role. In European universities, the assumption of secularism became so complete that religious belief marked you as intellectually suspect. The sociologist Peter Berger noted that American academics became secular while American society remained religious, creating a weird disconnect. But in Europe, the academic secularism spread to the entire educated middle class, then downward through culture. European literature, film, philosophy, and art became confidently post-Christian in a way American culture never quite did. Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, Ingmar Bergman, Samuel Beckett. These weren't people wrestling with God. They were exploring what comes after God's absence is simply accepted as fact. European intellectuals built sophisticated frameworks for living without transcendence. Existentialism, absurdism, various forms of secular humanism, all emerged from this European attempt to find meaning in a godless universe. What's fascinating is that many Europeans still participate in religious rituals without religious belief. In England, 70% of people still identify as Christian in surveys, but only 5% attend church regularly. What does it mean to call yourself Christian while never worshiping, never praying, not believing in God? It's cultural Christianity, an ethnic identity rather than a faith. Christian becomes a way of saying not Muslim, a marker of European civilization rather than personal conviction. This cultural Christianity is most visible at life transitions. Europeans still want church weddings even if they never attend services. They want their children baptized, though they won't raise them in faith. They want Christian funerals. The aesthetic and ritual appeal of Christianity persists, even as its truth claims are rejected. The cathedrals become beautiful settings for Instagram photos and occasional ceremonies, stripped of the cosmological meaning they were built to embody. Immigration has complicated the picture in ways few anticipated. Europe is importing religious vitality from exactly the places it once exported Christianity. There are now more practicing Muslims in London on Friday than practicing Anglicans on Sunday. African and South American immigrant churches are among the few Christian congregations in Europe that are growing, vibrant, and full of young people. This has created a strange situation. The grandchildren of European missionaries who converted Africa and South America are now secular, while the grandchildren of the converted are re-evangelizing Europe. Nigerian pastors run churches in Liverpool. Brazilian evangelicals fill former Catholic churches in Portugal. The flow of faith has reversed. But native Europeans aren't returning to Christianity, even as immigrants bring religious energy. If anything, the association of Christianity with immigrant communities reinforces native European secularism. Religion becomes coded as foreign, something for them, not us. European civilization, defined for over a millennium by Christianity, now increasingly defines itself by not being religious. The political implications are profound. Christian democratic parties, which dominated post-war European politics, have declined or transformed beyond recognition. The social vision that motivated European welfare states, Catholic social teaching, and Protestant civic responsibility has been severed from its religious roots. The question now haunting Europe is, can you maintain the ethics without the theology? So far, the answer seems to be, sort of. European societies remain relatively functional, civil, and orderly despite secularization. They haven't descended into the chaos Nietzsche predicted, but troubling signs appear. The willingness to sacrifice for future generations, to have children, to build for eternity rather than immediate comfort, these seem to be fading. When you don't believe in eternity, it's harder to think beyond your own lifetime. Let's talk about a specific cathedral to make this concrete. Cologne Cathedral, the magnificent Gothic structure in Germany that took 632 years to complete. Construction began in 1248, paused in 1473 when funds and interest ran out, resumed in 1840 during a romantic revival of medieval culture, and finished in 1880. For centuries, workers labored on a building they knew they wouldn't live to see completed. They did it for God, for future generations, for something transcendent. Today, Cologne Cathedral receives 6 million visitors annually. It's Germany's most visited landmark. On any given day, you'll find it packed with tourists, cameras clicking, tour guides explaining the architecture and history. Sunday Mass? Perhaps 500 people in a space that holds 20,000. The building succeeded. The faith it was built for did not. The maintenance of these empty cathedrals is itself revealing. European governments spend hundreds of millions of euros preserving churches as cultural heritage. They're considered part of European identity, treasures that must be protected. But protected as what? As monuments to a dead faith? As museums of belief? The preservation is meticulous, but it's archaeological, the care you give to ruins. Some cathedrals have tried to adapt. Reykjavik's Hallgrímskirkja, a stunning modernist church, hosts concerts. Vienna's Karlskirche charges admission and has installed an elevator to the frescoed dome for tourist viewing. Barcelona's Sagrada Familia, still under construction after 140 years, is essentially a ticketed attraction that happens to hold occasional masses. The holiness is secondary to the heritage. There's a painful irony here. These cathedrals were built as acts of faith by societies that were materially poor but spiritually rich. They represented enormous sacrifice, entire city budgets for decades, labor spanning generations. The builders believed they were constructing gateways to eternal life. Their wealthy, comfortable descendants keep the buildings in perfect condition, while viewing the beliefs behind them as quaint superstition. What would those medieval builders think if they could see their cathedrals today? Structures they created for the glory of God, filled with tourists in shorts taking selfies? Would they see it as desecration? Or would they be glad the buildings survived, even if their purpose didn't? Let's consider one more crucial factor: the role of education. As Europe secularized, religious education largely disappeared from public schools. In most of Western Europe, children now grow up with minimal exposure to even basic Christian teaching. They might know Christmas is about Jesus vaguely, but couldn't tell you the basic narrative of the Gospels. Biblical literacy has collapsed. This creates a generational break unique in European history. For 1,500 years, every European child learned Bible stories, Christian doctrine, the lives of saints. It was the common cultural reference point, the shared imaginative world. Literature, art, law, philosophy, all assume this knowledge. Today's European young people can't understand their own civilization's art and literature because they lack the religious literacy to decode it. Stand in the Sistine Chapel and watch tourists puzzle over the ceiling. They know it's Michelangelo, know it's important, but don't recognize the stories being depicted. The Last Judgment, the creation of Adam, these are visual references to narratives they've never learned. European civilization has become incomprehensible to Europeans. This educational secularization was deliberate. After World War II, many European intellectuals blamed religion, particularly Christianity's emphasis on faith and obedience, for enabling fascism. The solution was to raise generations free from religious thinking, emphasizing critical reasoning, science, and secular ethics. It worked, perhaps too well. The children raised this way didn't just reject problematic aspects of religion, they became unable to understand why anyone ever believed at all. In 2010, Pope Benedict XVI made a state visit to the UK, the first papal visit since the Reformation. The trip crystallized the bizarre position of Christianity in modern Europe. Protesters denounced the Pope as a representative of an oppressive institution. Security concerns were massive, not from religious fanatics, but from secular activists who viewed organized Christianity as inherently harmful. Meanwhile, the Pope spoke to the country as an outsider, attempting to re-evangelize a land that had been Christian for 1,400 years. The most revealing moment came at Westminster Abbey, where the Pope prayed at the shrine of Edward the Confessor, the medieval king saint. Here was the leader of world Catholicism in the heart of London, surrounded by monuments to a deeply Christian past, addressing a largely indifferent nation that had moved on. The gap between the stones and the people was absolute. England is particularly poignant because its de-Christianization came, despite the Church of England being the established state church. The Queen was supreme governor of the church. Bishops sit in the House of Lords. God Save the Queen is the national anthem. Yet all of this became mere ceremony, heritage, tradition without content. The establishment of the church may have actually accelerated its decline by making Christianity seem like a boring government institution, rather than a living faith. One theory holds that state churches kill religion by making it bureaucratic and compulsory. Look at Scandinavia, state Lutheran churches, near universal membership by default, and the lowest religious practice in Europe. Compare to America, no state church, separation of church and state, and high religiosity. Forced membership creates resentment. Voluntary association creates commitment. But this theory doesn't fully work either. France rigorously separates church and state since 1905, and it's as secular as Sweden. Spain only separated church and state in 1978, yet it secularized just as quickly. Ireland had no state church and was intensely Catholic until recently, then collapsed. The causation is murkier than any single explanation. Perhaps the most honest answer is this. Nobody fully understands why Europe secularized so thoroughly, so quickly, so completely. It's a confluence of factors: economic, social, intellectual, institutional, each reinforcing the others until faith simply couldn't survive in the ecology of modern European life. Like a species going extinct when its habitat changes too rapidly, Christianity in Europe couldn't adapt fast enough to modernity. So we're left with the cathedrals. These impossible buildings, stone prayers frozen in time, testaments to a certainty Europe no longer possesses. They stand as beautiful, expensive, melancholy reminders that entire civilizations can lose what once seemed permanent. When I first walked into Chartres Cathedral, I was overwhelmed by two simultaneous feelings. First, awe at what human beings could create when possessed by transcendent vision. Second, sadness that the vision is gone but the building remains, like a love letter found after the beloved has died. The cathedral is perfect, preserved, magnificent, but it's also a tomb. And here's the uncomfortable question. What does it mean for a civilization when its greatest architectural achievements are monuments to beliefs it no longer holds? When the things it builds now, shopping centers, airports, office blocks, are purely functional, while the things it maintains are temples to abandoned gods? Walking through Europe's empty cathedrals is like being in a library after everyone has forgotten how to read. The books are there, perfectly arranged, but the knowledge has been lost. Future archaeologists will puzzle over these structures, wondering what could have motivated such effort, such artistry, such expense. They'll know it was religious, but will they understand what that meant to the people who built them? I want to know what you think. What's your profession? Are you an architect, a theologian, a historian, someone who thinks about these questions, or someone encountering them for the first time? Your perspective shapes how you see this story. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this deep dive into one of history's most profound transformations has given you something to think about, consider supporting Professor Archive with a super thanks. It helps us keep exploring these complex questions. In a way, Europe's empty cathedrals are the perfect symbol for our historical moment. We inherit structures, institutions, ideas, and traditions from the past, but we're not sure what to do with them. We maintain them out of respect, aesthetic appreciation, cultural pride, but we don't believe what the builders believed. We're caretakers of treasures whose meaning has been lost. The question isn't whether this is good or bad. Committed secularists see it as liberation from superstition. Believers see it as tragic loss. Most Europeans simply shrug, neither triumphant nor mournful, just indifferent. And perhaps that indifference is the real story. The fact that most people in Europe no longer think the question of God's existence or Christianity's truth matters very much at all. The cathedrals will likely outlast us all. Stone endures. They'll still be standing in 2200, probably still empty, still beautiful, still puzzling to whoever looks at them. They'll remain as questions carved in stone. What did people once believe so strongly that they built this? And how did that belief disappear so completely that we can barely imagine it now? Europe gave the world Christianity and then showed the world how to live without it. Whether that's progress or loss, liberation or tragedy, depends on what you believe about the thing that was lost. But one fact is undeniable. The civilization that built these cathedrals is gone. We live in its afterlife, walking through its monuments, admiring its art, preserved in stone but dead in spirit. Maybe new life will emerge. Some predict a Christian revival as Europe confronts challenges that secularism struggles to answer. Others foresee Islam filling the religious void. Still others believe the secular future is permanent, that Europe has passed through religion to something beyond. Nobody knows. What we do know is this. On any given Sunday, if you want to see Christianity as it once was, don't go to Paris or London or Rome. Go to Lagos or Seoul or São Paulo. The faith that built Europe has migrated. The question is whether the buildings it left behind are monuments to failure or seeds waiting for a spring that may never come. The cathedrals stand empty, magnificent, and silent. They wait, as they've waited for centuries, as they may wait for centuries more. They are Europe's most beautiful unanswered question, carved in stone, reaching toward a heaven that most passers-by no longer believe is there.